Thanks for being here, as always. Hopefully this will be worth your time. I came prepared. So let's just quick begin with glory be to the Father, the Son,
Holy Spirit, amen.
Amen.
Glory be to the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, as was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, and world without end. Amen. Spirit, amen.
All right, so welcome to the second for the classes here, Foundations 2. This should be a little shorter than last time. As you know, I covered a lot of ground in the class before. So, we kind of end with this. A worldview is basically a response to and an interaction between these three questions: God's existence, the question of happiness, and also the reality of suffering, right? So, here's where we left off. We first differentiated philosophy from theology, right? Philosophy is everything you can know from reason alone, the study of reality, the cosmos, that whole body of knowledge that you access through reason alone. Theology, on the other hand, is basically the scientific exposition of all the truths that we can know from divine revelation. Knowledge from up high versus knowledge from down low. Of course, you need faith, of course, to intellectually assent to divine revelation. We affirm that God exists in his natural attributes, which basically culminated in the God of classical theism. So belief in God is actually a natural knowledge. It's a philosophical truth. It's knowable through reason alone. And a defining feature of the cosmos, of creation, is that fancy word called teleology, right? That intelligibility, design, goal-directedness in creation, final causality, purpose. And man, too, as kind of the pinnacle of creation, we too are created with a purpose, an ultimate end, God's he loves. And the question of happiness is essentially a search for that end. Everyone desires this formal idea of happiness, this teleological urge for perfect satiation of all of our desires, the perfection of our being, this radiating, rapturous joy that is unending, right? Everybody desires that. Yet, on a material level, we differ because the summum bonum, or material happiness, is the good that can confer that idea of happiness, and in virtue of us being human beings and free will, we differ, and there's diverging lifestyles, and different people assign ultimate worth to different ends, and as human beings endowed with free will, we can misconceive of the nature of the good that we are designed for, so we can err. That's a recap of last class, and hopefully, once again, I know last class was really heavy on the philosophy, on the metaphysics, but if you take away these, that was the rationale, that was the method, that was the point to it all. Really, ultimately, building that foundation based on reason, because our faith is not blind, it's not irrational. In fact, there is a very rich intellectual tradition that undergirds our entire faith, that reaches back millennia, as we'll actually see today. So, the search for happiness that we just talked about, we just discussed, it's as old as history itself. And up until the Enlightenment, the greatest minds, the greatest intellectuals that ever existed were fixed on that question of happiness. It was the intellectual, the predominant intellectual concern. So I'm going to go through a really brief historical exposition of some of these most prominent intellectuals, these minds, these philosophers preceding the incarnation of Christ, to see what they thought regarding the question of happiness in broad strokes. So generally speaking, all these philosophers, they never doubted that it was possible to attain happiness. They thought that, we all have this desire imprinted on our hearts, inscribed by the author of creation, and therefore, it must be something that is possible to obtain. So this generated an exhaustive interest in what might account for that highest good, the summum bonum, that supreme good, or material happiness, because they knew that they couldn't order their lives properly unless they knew the meaning of life and they identified that good. So much of the ancient philosophical thought on these matters is our foundation upon which we will see theology builds, and it perfects, and it elevates. So the whole point of what I'm going to do for the next 20 minutes here is seek to understand where we are by identifying and understanding from where we have come. And further objectives are, once again, demonstrate that rationality, the depth of the intellectual tradition undergirding a whole worldview, a philosophy of life, but also that philosophy is going to have its roadblocks. It's going to run up to a couple issues that it just can't overcome, and we'll investigate that. And it's one of those things that only a theological answer, a turn to religion, that will ultimately be able to address those. And Aristotle represents the culmination of philosophical excellence, and then Thomas Aquinas, of course, he's going to provide our theological answer that we're going to wrap up with today. He's our saint, the common doctor of the church. In many academic minds, he's the greatest intellect to ever live. So he's our theologian, so we're going to dip into the domain of theology at the end here today with Thomas Aquinas. So let's start there. Herodotus. He's a Greek historian, father of history, and he has a famous work called The History of Herodotus. And it's basically a text that details the Greco-Persian Wars, the Peloponnesian War. And of course, at the center of this, like all these ancient philosophers, the question of happiness is front and center. I'm not going to take you through everything that this text says, but it's basically a dialogue between a really wealthy king called Croesus, and he summons the wise man, right? The guy that's traveled all the world in search of knowledge. His name's Solon, and Croesus, the king, wants to know who the happiest man in the world is because he foolishly believes it's himself, right? He has everything, his power, wealth, women, etc. So Solon kind of blows his mind, gives him an unexpected answer, and says that the world's happiest man was this man, a family man, in the prime of his life, who just died in battle. And that the second happiest man was two sons that were twins that were pulling their disabled mother to a festival and died in their sleep after fatigue or something the next night. So that's kind of the essence of the dialogue, but I don't have time to get into the intricacies of that. But what's the worldview being presented here, according to Herodotus? It's a worldview in which inscrutable forces constantly threaten to subvert human aims. It's a world that's ruled by fate, ruled by the gods, in which suffering is all pervasive, and uncertainty is woven into the fabric of daily experience. So where life is governed by this uncertainty and suffering, no one can be counted as happy until he's dead. Thus, Herodotus says, it's death that's best for a man to win, because death solidifies and ensures in its finality all of one's goods in life, one's blessedness, and no longer be taken away. So like that health, that prosperity, all the familiar metrics that you can imagine are incorporated into a happy life. It's solidified, it's finalized at death. So that's what Solon, the wise man, was communicating to that wealthy, arrogant king. So happiness is a characterization of an entire life that can be reckoned only at death, and to believe oneself happy in the meantime, it's premature, it's foolish, and frankly, it's probably an illusion because the world is cruel, it's unpredictable, it's governed by forces beyond our control. So with this worldview, happiness at the dawn of Western human history was largely and entirely pretty much a matter of chance. So it should be no surprise that in a world where suffering is endemic and happiness is beyond our control, that conception is depressing, and you can call it tragic. So it should be not a surprise that this gave birth to the Greek tragedies, right? The playwrights, they seldom have happy endings. They center around situations in which innocent figures are overwhelmed by circumstances they can't control, forced to make impossible choices between irreconcilable alternatives. Basically, all to highlight that there can be no easy resolution to conflict, that you're always going to lose in some way, there's grave costs, and you can never be happy. Really depressing, unless the unlikely intervention of a god intervenes and kind of saves the day. Does, less of a occasion there than tragedies. But basically, this is a fatalistic worldview. That's the fancy philosophical word for that. It's fatalism. Happiness is what happens to us, and over that, we have no control. That summarizes this. I'm sharing this with you for a reason. It represents that perennial prehistoric view of man, that ancient view, reaching all the way back in which people conceived of the world, in which the rhythms of time were understood through myth and the universe, through the play of the gods. This is that first worldview of happiness that I'm presenting. And again, it's basically happiness is sown in the soil of chance. And that actually is still retained today in a lot of Indo-European languages, connecting happiness to, pretty much luck, blind luck, fate, chance, even our English word, happiness, happen chance. So there's a little fun fact there, that's interesting. But, yet at the same time, and in the same place, a new perspective, this is where we're transitioning to the next piece there, Socrates and Plato. A new perspective on happiness was taking place that dared to hold that human beings might hope to influence their fate through actions of their own. So let me ask you, can any of you think of what other innovation coincided with this in human history, inspired it even in Athens, Greece, related to politics? The advent, innovation, invention of
democracy.
Yes, there we go, democracy, right? So this yearning for human agency, human control over their fate, their happiness, it was born from that new and unique consciousness of collective agency. Democracy, power of the people. People have the power. So basically that concept was extended to the domain, the long-standing domain of happiness. And Socrates, he was the first to consider in detail the question of happiness and its necessary conditions. He was the innovator, the founder of this philosophical question of happiness, and basically would leave a monumentous legacy. Because in doing so, he would fascinate classical minds for centuries to come. He would tutor Plato and Aristotle and pretty much inaugurate a whole new era of philosophy that would shape the course of Western civilization, including, of course, today our own state is built upon natural law, which first, was articulated in some degree of accuracy by Socrates, and of course democracy. So this is a big deal. So by doing so, this quote is illustrative of that monumental impact. Cicero said, Socrates wrestled philosophy from the heavens and brought it down to the earth. So from the domain of the gods, of luck and chance, to the domain of man and his own autonomy over his happiness. So unfortunately, Socrates didn't leave behind a body of thought or written testimony of his teachings. Everything we know about Socrates came from his most brilliant student, Plato. Plato wrote 24 dialogues, and in these dialogues, Plato uses Socrates as the main character, his mentor, his master, to preserve the form and content of his teachings. So real briefly, these are the big takeaways, the keys about happiness espoused by Socrates as seen through the lens of Plato. So number one, all human beings naturally desire happiness. Perhaps you remember me sharing that with you last class as I introduced this topic. So Socrates grounds the search for happiness in natural human longing. It's a desire that's self-evident. All people desire happiness in virtue of the fact it's always the end goal of all of our activity. And by happiness here, Socrates doesn't mean sensual pleasure. Rather, the happiness that he has in mind is loftier, it's grander, it's a higher goal that lies beyond the satisfaction and enjoyment of the senses. Number two, happiness is obtainable through human effort. Obviously, this is that radical break from that fatalistic worldview that preceded him, where happiness was entirely controlled by the gods, by luck, by fate, etc. And the interesting thing here is that he just totally punts, he ignores the problem of evil, the problem of suffering, the problem of death. Because of course, if he makes the claim that happiness is obtainable, you gotta deal with those big issues of, how does that square and reconcile with suffering and death? He punts on that, doesn't even really touch it. We'll see how Aristotle has the fortitude to actually address that. Next one, happiness does not depend on external things. External things like money, possessions, even your good looks, your abilities, etc. Those are conditional goods. A wise person uses money in the right way in order to make his life and other people's life better. An ignorant person will be wasteful and use the money poorly, leaving him, in a worse situation than he was before. Hence, external goods are in themselves incapable of making one happy. They can be misused. So Socrates makes it clear that the key to happiness is not to be found in the goods that one accumulates, but rather in the agency of the person who gives them direction and focus. Next one, happiness is teachable. This is a huge concept. There's a lot of depth here. I'm going to try to briefly go through it. But happiness depends on the education of desire. The soul has to learn how to harmonize its desires, redirecting its gaze away from those base physical pleasures to the love of knowledge, to the love of virtue. Of course, we have a lot of misdirected desires sometimes that are irrational, like for fortune, for power, for glory, for esteem, for riches, etc., right? So desire needs to be carefully disciplined to achieve a right ordering of the soul. And this ascent to happiness, it's tough, it's long, it's arduous, it takes a whole lifetime often. Socrates lays out that in your youth, the trainee is trained from finding individual instances of beauty attractive to learning how to appreciate beauty in general. And then from there, put a higher value on the beauty of the mind, on contemplation of reality, on philosophical truths, to become a lover of wisdom, to look beyond what he once desired. And in an interesting excerpt from this section in the dialogue of Plato, he articulates that this vision of the rapturous contemplation of beauty, which he, by the way, likens to sexual intercourse between the lover of wisdom and truth, it satiates desire and happiness flows forth. That, if ever, Socrates says, is the moment when life is worth living. Just one mystical experience of truth, of beauty, of goodness will make all the sufferings, all the tribulations of life worth it, meaningful, worth experiencing. And the last one here, virtue and happiness are inextricably linked, such that it would be impossible to have one without the other. Put simply, the just person is happier than the unjust person. Justice refers to a state of harmony among the different parts of the soul. We'll more on that in a second. Injustice is a civil war between the soul, between the higher faculties of mind, and of course our body, our passions, our appetites, our instincts. So the just soul is equipped to maintain an inner peace, a composure, despite whatever life throws at them. So the big theme here, what all these things have in common, the common denominator, is that happiness is internally spoken about, which is a radical break from anything prior to Socrates and Plato, redefining the conventional concept of happiness. So here's an image of that. This is huge. My high schoolers love this because this applies to literally everything you'll ever do in life, whether it's career, whether it's your studies, whether it's sports. This is the harmonious soul, the famous charioteer image given by Plato. So the man on the chariot, he represents the intellect. The horses represent our bodily passions, our instincts, our appetites, our emotions. And then the reins, forget what this picture says, I didn't write that. Instead of desire, just think of the human will. So the reins represents the human will. If the charioteer uses the reins correctly, he can steer the horses wherever he wants. What happens if he lets go of the reins? Right? The horses go crazy and drag the chariot all over the place. So the question is, who's in command of the will? Who's in command of the reins? Is it reason, or is it your bodily passions? Lesson being, our intellect is supposed to govern our passions through the rein of the will. If we let go of our will, we lose control and our passions take over, which means we become obsessed with sex, food, money, power, all these things that we all see frankly everywhere, right? The horses run wild and the chariot gets dragged behind. However, if the intellect holds a firm grasp on the reins of the will and implements that education of desire, right, which is the essence of virtue, he controls and tames the horses, and the horses can facilitate him, actually. He's master of the horses. He can win races. He becomes master of his destiny. So this example demonstrates that one's passions are out of control. An example of this would be, the classic gluttonous example, right? We all love ice cream. At a certain point, if you eat enough ice cream, your reason, your intellect is going to say, hey, maybe I should, give it a break, maybe I should stop, I'm going to feel like crap afterwards, So, which course will your will take? Are you going to give in to your appetite, your bodily, desire to keep eating, or you're going to listen to your mind? You can apply this to anything, even parenting. Sometimes it takes a tremendous amount of energy and rationality and intention to make a good parenting decision and discipline and corrective behavior when maybe you're just drained, you expended all your energy for the day. It's easy by default to just let something slide and give into that passion, that laziness. So this is self-mastery. This is what I teach high schoolers, and they cling on to it because there's nothing tougher in life than you'll ever do than get this picture implemented and integrated into your life. A harmonious soul, where your passions, everything in your lower nature is subjected to your higher nature. And it's difficult because it's part of original sin. We're inclined the opposite way. We're inclined towards our passions, towards sin, towards our body. It takes virtue, I'm getting ahead of myself, but the essence of the moral life is achieving a harmonious soul. So I thought that'd be interesting to share. And it stems from Plato, again, 4 or 5 centuries before Christ, before the advent of Christianity. One last contribution, I'm just going to zero in on the second part of this. There's higher pleasures of the just life, which are philosophical pleasures, in tangent with what I just mentioned with the education of desire. The excellence of pursuing knowledge that produces almost a godlike state in the human being. The philosophical pleasures whereby man comes to a greater understanding of reality are pure pleasures because they concern these higher parts of the soul, but also they're not bound to the relativity produced by physical things. So the key here is acquire a likeness to God. This is a theme that's going to be kind of picked up by Aristotle and foreshadows divine revelation, where theology is going to step in and take over. And it's really, really profound, actually. There's this constant, likeness that Plato, that Socrates, that Aristotle, even the Stoics and Cicero would say that their conception of happiness produces a godlike state in a human being. So happiness is purely internally driven, according to Socrates, and according to Plato. So then, this famous quote, one must examine himself and his life, implement what he needs to do for that education of desire to attain that harmonious, right-ordered soul. All of those takeaways about happiness flow from self-examination, right? So that's the famous quote by Socrates. Next, last one here, Aristotle. And after we go through Aristotle, I'll give you guys a quick break, and then we're just going to introduce Aquinas and the domain of theology finally stepping in, right? So we went from that fatalistic worldview by Herodotus to wrestling that philosophy from heaven down to earth with Socrates and Plato, where human beings actually have control and agency over their destiny, over their happiness. Now we reach the pinnacle of philosophy in Aristotle, who builds upon and refines all of that he inherited. He was the most brilliant student of Plato, and anybody know who he's famous for tutoring in history? Another huge figure in history? Matt probably knows that.
Yeah, I'm not
just say it. What's
I'm
that?
not allowed to answer.
Alexander the Great. So he was the tutor of Alexander the Great. And enshrining happiness as a central purpose of human life, as you can see from that quote I shared with you guys up there, he devoted more attention to this topic of happiness than any thinker prior. And he engages this topic most thoroughly in the Nicomachean Ethics. And I've read that whole thing like 6 times, and I keep getting new things from it, but it's brilliant. So, fascinating point is he represents a philosophical and temperamental opposite of Socrates and Plato. Whereas Plato and Socrates, they strove for wisdom in the world beyond, while adapting a more skeptical posture towards the things of this world. Aristotle's attention was primarily horizontal. He grounded the foundation of his theory of happiness on a robust scientific analysis and experience of the phenomena of the world. And he wrote so many famous works, the metaphysics, the systematic categorization of all of philosophy. It's just good stuff, unless you're bored with philosophy. If you did not like my last talk, you would not like reading the metaphysics by Aristotle. But anyways, he's brilliant. And these were thinkers that didn't just have a narrow focus, but they knew astronomy, mathematics, English, rhetoric, just everything, Renaissance. So that's Aristotle. His point of departure should be no surprise, teleology. In fact, he was the founder. He's the first to ever provide a thorough, precise, systematic treatment of final causality, right? Nature does not act in vain. All things, natural or created, man-made or divine, are intended to fulfill a purpose. So a full explanation of anything must consider its final cause. If you remember that from last presentation, I showed you Aristotle developed the 4 causes, Philosophy 101. The final cause, he's the founder of this, right? So he believes in an ordered universe, a universe that proceeds from the pure intellect of God, in which all creation has a purpose and a place. So just as an acorn is intended to be an oak tree, just as a knife is intended to cut, so too man is intended for some end, some purpose, some telos. That was a big takeaway from my last talk. That originated with Aristotle, 4 centuries before the advent of Christianity. And it's making a huge reemergence in the universities actually today. Dr. Ed Fraser writes a great book about this called Aristotle's Revenge. So this stuff is more relevant than ever. People are rediscovering the richness and beauty of pre-Enlightenment philosophy. But that's kind of aside and going off on a little tangent there. So this telos, this end of man, has to be appropriate to our nature. So in his search, Aristotle elaborates these 2 criteria for identifying the summum bonum, the ultimate end, the ultimate good. 1 has to be self-sufficient and final. So it's always desirable in and of itself, can't be instrumental, can't be for the sake of anything else. And of course, it has to be attainable. So, man has a purpose. Aristotle tries to identify this purpose by isolating our most distinctly human activity. And of course, what I'm referring to there is that unlike plants and vegetation that grow, or animals that are governed by instinct and senses, human beings possess as our unique activity the ability to live and act in accordance with reason. So we're rational agents. We have autonomy over our human actions, right? So, to be a good human being is to be a happy human being. And to be a good human being is to live according to our special human virtue that I just said, reason. And happiness consists not just in mere passive enjoyment, because that's open to animals, that's open to groups, but in action, right? That kind of action that's proper to man in contrast with other animals. And what I'm talking about there is intellectual action. But not all kinds of intellectual action result in happiness, but only virtuous action. And I wish I could go off and talk about virtue and talk about man and how all these faculties and appetites interact with each other on a human anthropological level. But maybe we'll have to save that for another class. But virtuous action, that is action that springs from virtue and acts according to its laws. So, the good life entails making intelligent choices through the proper use of reason that promotes the flourishing of our kind of organism. So happiness, Aristotle concludes, is an activity of the soul expressing virtue. This formulation was monumental. Despite it seems really simple, it seems really simplistic, but it was monumental. It reaffirmed that central contention of Socrates and Plato that centered around happiness as a function of virtue. But Aristotle reinforces it with his major teleological assumption that human beings in the world they inhabit participate in a larger order that gives them meaning. So that's his definition of happiness for the time being. Happiness is an activity of the soul expressing virtue. Real briefly, it's worth touching on how happiness and pleasure are related. He immediately harshly dismisses the view that he attributes to the many, the most vulgar. You know, that happiness consists of pleasure, more relevant than ever, because we all know people in our life that subscribe to this view, right? Life is all about pleasure. In other words, hedonism. That's hedonism, right? But all these ancient philosophers, they brutally ridiculed this position. As you can see with the little quote there, completely slavish, befitting the lives of grazing animals among humans. So where that stems from is, again, we're humans, we have rational faculties, animals don't have them, so like why would human happiness appeal to our lower animalistic bodily nature, right? Obviously it has to do with our higher part of our nature. But Aristotle says pleasure emerges from excellent activity as its normal completion. So pleasure doesn't show up in the official essence of happiness, but it emerges from excellent activity as its completion. So a good life feels good, but Aristotle is careful to articulate that it does not follow that everything that feels good in life is good, right? So it's paramount that we're taught to feel pleasure and pain in the right way for the right things. Again, that education of desire. Hopefully it reminds you of that. If man takes pleasure in bad things, that pleasure is bad, which suggests that one can live a pleasurable life while being a bad person. Again, shock, right? We all see that in, all around us, right? People that live really enjoyable, pleasurable lives, but objectively, they're bad people. They're not virtuous. They're filled with vice. So in the short run, man can enjoy bad actions, but in the long run, those inner contradictions assert themselves and they emerge. So a bad person doesn't really enjoy his life in terms of this classical view of happiness. He doesn't like the person that he's become. He's unable to be a friend of himself. And again, you can see this play out, you can imagine, with alternative lifestyles, bad decisions. It's no coincidence that high suicide rates accompany these things a lot of times, right? It's this inner contradiction asserting itself. So, happiness and pleasure. Here's where things get interesting. I know I'm probably starting to lose you there with those last two slides. But, as I said, Aristotle, he reinforces Socrates and Plato. Virtue has a central place in the life of happiness. But it's not enough. It's not enough of its own strength. It's not sufficient on its own. Why? Here's where the problem of evil, suffering, and death come in, and here's where Aristotle actually has the fortitude and the honesty to grapple with this, right? So he's forced to basically concede that there is a certain amount of good luck, favorable circumstances that are factored into this equation of happiness. Because, of course, as I include a quote there, someone might possess a life of virtue, but still suffer evils and misfortunes, and of course ultimately die. You could spend an entire life of virtue, but still die. People still get sick. Maybe your loved one will die. Something like that, right? So, basic chart, happiness is a function of virtue and favorable circumstances and luck, right? So, but despite that being said, he still thinks that happiness is well within the grasp of most people, unless you're deformed in your ability to be virtuous for whatever reason. So, happiness will be widely shared, according to Aristotle. Now here's where things get really interesting, right? So the Nicomachean Ethics, big bulky book. I'd say the first 95% of it covers everything I just did in broad strokes. In a surprising turn towards the end of those ethics, that last 5%, Aristotle makes an interesting concession. He basically says everything I just covered before that, that's only capable of conferring a secondary happiness. Above them lies a highest expression of our highest faculty that he calls the pure exercise of reason or contemplation. And this is our highest happiness. So highest happiness can be found not in the ethical virtues of the moral life, but in the contemplative, philosophical life of speculation, where the speculative virtues of understanding, science, and wisdom, they're exercised. So while all other forms of activity are merely human, contemplation, once again, this theme reemerges. It's divine. It's divine. The life of pure contemplation is the most godlike life, because traditionally it's assumed that the gods are way more blessed, way more happy than we are, and that they spend their time, the gods do, in pure contemplation. As the origin of all reality, the creator of all reality, the gods are thought to spend their time contemplating the reality that emerged from them, right? So that's where that comes from. So, in the end, the life of pure contemplation is the most godlike life. And it's the activity that comes closest to fulfilling the conditions of happiness that we're looking for. It's the most harmonious realization of man's powers. It culminates in the exercise at its highest capacity of the noblest power of reason, and it's least contingent upon external circumstances. Hence, it's the most self-sufficient. And here's Aristotle articulating that. Such a life of wisdom spent in this undeviating contemplation of truth is the greatest source of happiness. So, it's kind of ironic. An apparently worldly Aristotle, that horizontally, fixed philosopher, can't help but turn his gaze upward in a manner reminiscent of Plato, where he's fixed on the transcendent forms of the good, the true, the beautiful. He's unable to conceive of happiness without a reference to the gods or God. So he unwittingly casts a shadow on pretty much everything he wrote before in the Nicomachean Ethics, which should, if you're Catholic, remind you of Aquinas, the greatest theologian that ever lived. Actually had a very similar experience where at the end of his life, he was caught up in a rapturous, mystical experience and never wrote a single thing after that because he said nothing, he can never articulate the words, this mystical experience that God decided to envelop him into. So it's kind of fitting that Aristotle seemed to experience something very similar here. So here's a summary. Philosophy, right? Reason alone. How can reason alone answer the question of happiness? It all boils down to this. Happiness consists in a life of virtuous activity and natural contemplation, or specifically a natural contemplation of God. And one also needs good luck, favorable circumstances. So with that said, it's worth critiquing Aristotle, because this is where I'm going to really highlight that ceiling, those roadblocks, those obstacles that philosophy just can't overcome, even with its brightest philosophers. The first critique, it's the limitation of the attainment of man's proper end to a handful of philosophers, or what other academics call the elite few. It's not possible for man to spend more than brief periods of his life in that contemplation, because fatigue, the interruptions of daily life, they interrupt it, and they interrupt that calm down from that exalted peak. Further, that life of contemplation is contingent upon a certain reliance on external goods. It's hard to pursue that life, say if you're starving, or you're poor, or you're sick, right? So there needs to be a sufficiency of external goods that accompany that contemplation. So in the end, the ideally perfect life is really only possible for a very few, and then only in part. The next critique is an unaccounted for factor, which is situations in which life according to virtue demands total sacrifice. So a soldier sometimes has to give up his life in battle, right? Or a citizen prefers death to a political lie, being an accomplice to that, right? Or where a man must give his life up for his friends. A mother might give up her life for her kids. What meaning can the happy life have when life itself is cut off? Here's where that problem of death asserts itself, which leads me into that third critique. And this one comes from Aquinas himself. He articulates this brilliantly. So we saw that Aristotle laid out that self-sufficiency criteria, that this ultimate good, the summum bonum, has to be self-sufficient. It's desirable in and of itself. It can't point to or be instrumental in attaining anything after that. He argues that Aristotle's conception fails this in three ways. One, it lacks the perfect fulfillment of all reasonable desire because of evil and suffering in the world, and ultimately our death. Evil, by definition, is a deprivation of good, and of course death deprives us of the good of life, right? So death keeps man from having a good life continually. Say, for the sake of example, man could spend his entire life in virtue and like a mystical contemplation, natural contemplation of God. Maybe he can somehow spend his entire life. He's still going to die. That good is still cut off, and it's reasonable to desire more, that lasts eternally, right? So that fails that self-sufficiency criteria. So Aquinas ends up asserting that only a life without evil and without death would actually meet Aristotle's self-sufficiency criteria. So I hope that makes sense to you guys. Any good that you can possibly encounter in this life, it's at the whim of things outside of our control: suffering, evil, death, right? That's a problem. So with that said, upon sober analysis, Aristotle's thought, while largely true and widely regarded as the apex of philosophy, it gets as close as it can possibly get to providing a satisfying answer to the question of happiness, but it runs into that roadblock, it runs into that ceiling, as those critiques demonstrate. It is imperfect. It's not totally sufficient and satisfying. Because of these two problems, just to reinforce this point, because it's crucial. Problem one, suffering and death. As long as suffering and death are part of the human condition, perfect happiness cannot be had. And problem two, this is more implicit than Aristotle, but nevertheless true, called the infinite gap. So natural contemplation of God. Aristotle can contemplate God as the creator, as the first cause, as all those boring things that I laid out in that first class, right? You can contemplate God as the uncaused cause, the unmoved mover, the perfectly necessary non-contingent being, the standard of perfection, the intelligent designer, right? You can know God through his creative effects and by analogy. He can contemplate that God. That's a natural contemplation. But he can't actually know God. We are incapable of knowing God's essence, understanding or comprehending a part of God's actual inner nature, right? That's inaccessible to reason alone, to philosophy, to human nature alone. It exceeds our capacities. Therefore, there's that infinite gap between the creator and creature, the infinite creator and the finite creature. So we know that this all-encompassing, perfect good exists, as Aristotle did. He knew God exists, but he could not possibly fathom. In fact, literally his imagination couldn't even fathom a way that we could actually have a relationship with God, to know God, to love God, and participate in that love that is his inner life. There's an infinite gap there. That's another roadblock that's crucial. You're going to see, and you can probably anticipate how theologies can answer that question, right? But I'll go there in depth and hopefully provide a beautiful answer to that next class. So the philosopher can know that the all-satisfying object of his desire does exist, but he knows that it's an object that transcends our human nature. It exceeds our capacities. It's beyond reach. So the path forward, how do we proceed? Right? In light of this consideration that these mysteries, they're inaccessible to philosophy, reason alone, we shouldn't regress, which actually happened in the preceding centuries before Christ, with Zeno, with Epicurus, with Stoicism, Marcus Aurelius even, right, Stoicism. These are responses to these shortcomings, or even modern post-Enlightenment philosophers like Kant or Descartes. There's a lot of regression and backwards movement that can happen here. I would posit that the path forward should be a path that preserves the truths of philosophical thought, but also one illumined by that God that you affirm exists, right? Illumined and elevated through the truths of divine revelation. So that's actually safely consistent with Aristotelian thought, because Aristotle himself said that happiness is superior to the human level. Think about how profound that is. Our happiness is superior to the human level, tantamount to the divine. Maybe he didn't know that there was that infinite gap there, and that but there's just no answer before the divine revelation, right? So preserving that truth, that's the Catholic posture. That's how Catholic Christians religion answers this, right? It builds on philosophy. It doesn't negate all the truths about nature that reason alone discovered, but grace, religion, divine revelation, it builds upon, it perfects, and it elevates human nature, builds upon philosophy. As I mentioned in that very opening slide, right? Philosophical truths lead to theological truths, or philosophical questions lead to theological answers. So now we're entering the domain of theology. Maybe that makes you feel good, because everything prior, and we're done with philosophy, right? Maybe that was all brand new, because barely anybody's taught philosophy anymore, how to rationally, systematically think your way through some of these big things. But I hope that was worth your time. So we're entering the theological domain here. Recall that the happy man was not the one who had approach the gods, as I shared with Socrates, with Plato, with Aristotle. Philosophy reaches its terminus here, its limit, the point of limit. At this point, the limit of its capacity. So to learn whether or not that help is offered to us, that bridges that gap, the philosopher has to turn to an examination of religion, to theology, to divine revelation. And as I just alluded to before, is it really so absurd that we affirm that God, if classical theism exists, that he wouldn't reveal himself in an exceptional, powerful manner? It just makes sense, right? So that's where I'm stopping. I'll give you guys a quick little break here. Let's wrap this up and let's continue here.
Sounds good, Tom.
Yeah. Has it been all right so far?
So far, so good.
All right. So we're picking up with St. Thomas Aquinas. So here is where God, as known by divine revelation, intervenes and provides a definitive answer to the question of happiness that was raised but not answered sufficiently by philosophy. And once again, as I said, demonstrates how philosophy culminates in theology. Philosophy always considers what constitutes man's happiness, and it did precisely that, identifying a life of virtue and a contemplation of God as constituent of man's happiness. But theology asks how to bridge that infinite gap, how to reconcile evil, suffering, and death, right? So that's how Aquinas approached the question as a philosopher and a theologian. So he knew from divine revelation, from being a Catholic Christian, he knew the answer to this question. But nevertheless, he systematically goes through it in the exact same frame as Aristotle did, essentially. And he does this in the Prima Secundae, which is the first part of the second part of the Summa Theologiae, if you know anything about Aquinas. That's questions 1 through 5. It's called the Treatise on Happiness. And it introduces this whole conception of the moral life. So everything you learn in morals and ethics, it's organized, it's framed, it's structured around a response to the question of happiness. What is our ultimate end? What's it all about? What's our goal? If something helps us get there and is compatible with that, it's good. If something detracts and militates against that pursuit, it's bad. That alone is a revolutionary way that you can think about the moral life. So everything that the church teaches that perhaps is shocking and controversial, it's not there to be a buzzkill or to be oppressive or be intrusive on your life. It's supposed to help you, teach you how to flourish. Literally, conforming yourself to that moral teaching is going to make you happier, more full of peace, joy, meaningful relationships, etc. So, for Aquinas, happiness is about perfection, of course, as we anticipate perfection of our rational faculties of intellect and will. The perfection of knowing the truth and loving the good. So happiness is perfect human fulfillment. That summum bonum that we possess is the perfect realization of our human potential, specifically as it relates to our reason, right? Our rational intellect and then our rational will. The whole frame that he uses, everything that Aristotle articulated about virtue and contemplation of God, constitutes what Aquinas calls natural happiness. So he posits a twofold perfection of this rational nature, twofold perfection of a human being. The first one is natural happiness, basically everything that Aristotle said. That is possible for us to attain in this life. But, and is in fact ordered by more perfect and complete happiness, beyond anything the human might possibly imagine or conceive, that's supernatural happiness. So just to read the end part of this quote here, beyond this natural happiness, there's still another to which we can look forward in the future, whereby we shall see God as he is. This is beyond the nature of every created intellect. This is the happiness that St. Thomas Aquinas deals in his Summa Theologiae. Again, Aristotle could never have dreamed of this supernatural end being a not only a reality, but a possibility. But we're getting a little ahead of ourselves. We're going to back up a tiny bit. But that's the frame. There's natural happiness and supernatural. Supernatural means above human nature, above our capacities in nature. So can that perfect supernatural happiness be had on earth? Put simply, no. We can have imperfect happiness on earth, or a natural happiness, and that's supposed to be a participation in and foreshadow and lead to perfect happiness that exists after death. And we'll see, of course, in the next couple of classes how that makes sense, how that plays out, how that works. So this is a pretty illustrative. I know my students really like this in high school, but just a duration differentiation. So when we talk about pleasure, right, it's short term. It's unstable, it's not lasting, it's not obviously true happiness, but think about things that are appealing to our lower bodily nature, so good food, sexual pleasure, or Vikings win. Long term, so that's felicity, joy. Those are, that is joy that proceeds from maybe virtue, right? Like our higher nature, our rational nature. So a virtuous life, having a family, having kids, fulfilling career. So that's longer, it's deeper, it's higher, but ultimately it's unstable and not true happiness. And then that supernatural happiness that I just introduced, of course, that's eternal. That's referred to by philosophers as beatitude. And as we'll see, that means participating in the divine life of God. Of course, it's eternal, it's lasting, and it's stable. It cannot be lost. So Aquinas opens with that frame, natural versus supernatural happiness, and then he goes on to systematically prove all of these points that I'm not going to bore you with, but everything I kind of introduced with Aristotle, Aquinas revisits and affirms and kind of enhances in some ways, but basically goes to show that man acts for an end. He affirms the metaphysical principle of finality, the necessity of a final end. There has to be a final end that exists. It has to be a one single final end. There can't be multiple final ultimate ends. And that is, an individual cannot simultaneously have more than one final end, even if you're mistaken about the nature of that end. And the ultimate end of this is the same for every human being in virtue of our common nature. The structure of our flourishing is going to have the same character. So he goes through all of that in a really systematic, dense way that I'm not going to present here. But he arrives at this point, right? Rather than skip ahead to the true answer, like I said, Aquinas knows the true summum bonum, the ultimate good. Rather, he seeks to deconstruct all the popular misconceptions of the summum bonum that are reflected by the different lifestyles, of course, right? Again, a product of human free will. So, can the following goods correspond to the universality of human striving? Can they guarantee human happiness, human completion? I'll just ask you guys this one, and then I'll go through the next. Can you think of a reason why wealth, and by wealth I mean food, like material wealth, like food, houses, cars, or artificial wealth, like money or crypto or something? Why is wealth not the ultimate good? Can you think back to that criteria? Self-sufficiency. It's a good.
Lost.
Lost?
It can be lost.
It can be lost. Yeah. What do you do with money?
You can do evil as well as good.
Well, point being, it's instrumental, right? So, two reasons. Nobody just collects money for its own sake, right? You use it to buy houses, cars, possessions, and stuff like that. It's instrumental, right? So it remains a means to serve basic needs and other ends. But also, the potential infinity of human acquisitiveness of money, right? There's never a point where you realize, oh, I have enough money, I'm going to stop getting money, right? So there's this boundless attempt to acquire money. But the key point there to take away, it's instrumental. You use money for another good, and that violates the self-sufficiency criteria laid out by Aristotle, that Aquinas affirms, that it can't be a means to another end, right? So here's wealth. What about honor? Honor is only a sign and a testament to excellence, and thus being a sign and a derivative phenomena, it can't itself constitute finality or completion. What about fame or glory? Like my dad said, this is something that actually I'll cover that in the next one. This one depends on human estimation, which of course is subject to error. It also depends on the good quality of the honorable person, thus remaining a derivative phenomenon. Power. Our ultimate end, the sigma bonum, can't consist in power, because power is indifferent to good and evil, right? Power is like money. It's an intermediary. It can be used well, virtuously, or poorly, viciously. So the very concept of an ultimate good, the sigma bonum, is incompatible with even the possibility of evil. So the good use of power is not here in the term power itself, so power can't be considered a final end. What about health, beauty, and strength? Aquinas calls these goods of the body. Put simply, anyone that affirms human beings are a composite of body and soul, which basically everybody in the beginning, in the history of man, has affirmed, right? That we are human beings, we are endowed with an immaterial spiritual soul, we are rational. Anybody that acknowledges that concedes that our lower nature should be subject to our higher nature, right? Reason should govern our passions or bodily appetites. So therefore, goods of the body are ordered to the goods of the soul, and therefore cannot be our ultimate end. Pleasure, as I've already touched on before, this has always been brutally, ruthlessly ridiculed by philosophers, those that pursue pleasure as their ultimate end in life, right? I guess I won't go over that anymore. But what we're arriving at here is not one created good is in a position to fulfill wholly the infinite striving of the human being. Our intellect cannot know and understand so much as to not be capable and desirous of knowing more, and our will, our will cannot love and enjoy so many goods as to not be capable of more. These two faculties that we have, our intellect and our will, they're never going to be satisfied until they find a universal object. All the created finite goods of the world that we encounter, they're particular goods. So these are never going to be satisfied until we find a universal object. And once that is known and loved, it's going to leave no more truths to be known and no more good to be loved. So the human will, which can only desire that which the intellect perceives as good, is finally drawn not to created finite worldly goods, but to goodness itself, to being itself, which alone is capable of exhausting its capacity, right? So I always teach my students, we as human beings with those rational faculties of mind and will, this immaterial soul that we have, this spiritual soul, we reach out to the infinite. Anything created and finite and worldly, they are good, don't get me mistaken. They're good, but they're not the good. They're not goodness itself. It's not the terminus to which our faculties are ordered, right? And actually, nature has a way of actually asserting this truth in a beautiful way, something we can all eminently relate to, right? It's called the law of diminishing returns. So again, something I share with my high school students is, think about when you're a kid and Christmas Day, you go down and you see your whole host of Christmas presents, right? You're in ecstasy. It's like a rapturous joy, the novelty, the excitement, right? But it only takes like a day or two before you open everything and the novelty and that excitement wears off and you return to kind of your normal state, right? Or what about the song? My brother was known for obsessing over a single song and then listening to it like a trillion times in a row, and then it gets to the point where he hates the song, right? The returns, they diminish. Or even if you travel to a place and there's the novelty and the newness of a place you've never explored before long, you grow accustomed to it and it loses its thrill, right? You want to go home. So, man, we reach out to the infinite, right? So, In the end, no created thing can satisfy these spiritual, infinite desires that we have, mind and will, to know the truth, to love the good. Therefore, nothing created has ever been able to fill the heart of man. God alone, the only infinite being, goodness itself, being itself, as we covered in the first class, he alone can fill it infinitely, right? So this is arriving at the theological question. And honestly, so far, this is probably what Aristotle could have discovered too, right? Because, like I said, he did identify God as that all-embracing good. But he just had no conception of how to possess it or what the nature of that possessing looks like. So, to breeze through this, Aquinas basically says, so if God is the summum bonum, the ultimate good, what's the nature of this possession? It has to consist in activity. All essences achieve and attain their completion through activity, or the transition from potency to act. So, our human possessing of God has to manifest itself in activity. So what activity? Is it an activity of the mind or the will, primarily? Aquinas opts for reason, thus splitting from St. Augustine and the Augustinian tradition of will. I won't bore you with the theological explanation there, but basically happiness is the possession of the ultimate end, and the act of the will doesn't consist in that because it's either oriented towards that striving, that yearning, that desiring, or it happily possesses the end. So happiness can only consist essentially in an act of reason. So what active reason, right? We're kind of boring you with technicalities here probably, but speculative contemplation, an act of pure reason. So again, this word contemplation reemerges that, again, should remind you of Aristotle, who, labeled that the highest expression of our highest faculty lies in contemplation. Same thing here. The activity of reason is speculative contemplation. So this possessing activity can only consist in contemplation. So here we arrive at the answer, right? It's called the beatific vision of God. There's a million names for this. Eternal life, salvation, participation in the divine nature, divine son. There's an endless list of terms that describe this reality, but Aquinas and philosophy, theology, post-Christendom has termed it the beatific vision. So to more fully appreciate the sublimity of this, again, recall Aristotle's conception of happiness and running into that infinite gap problem. This is the solution, right? This is the way in which we can possess God. We can actually comprehend a part of God's divine essence through created grace. So happiness consists in a vision of the divine essence. So what do we mean here by vision? The church doesn't mean seeing with their eyeballs, of course. It means comprehension with the intellect. In the same way that a physics student or a math student, goes through a tough problem or formula and arrives at the answer and says, now I see, right? It references a comprehending of something. And to comprehend God is to be divinized. Remember, that supernatural end, it's above, it transcends our natural capacities. So to actually experience this means that we have to be elevated, deified, divinized in a certain way. That's what supernatural means, right? This is a supernatural ultimate end. So to attain it, we have to be a participant in the divine nature, which is why I wrote that there, perfection of our participation in the divine nature, which, by the way, if you're in a state of grace right now, you've received the sacrament of baptism, you have sanctifying grace in your soul, you are participating in the divine nature right now, imperfectly, because it's mediated through sense and through life and through all these obstructions that we encounter in life. But in heaven, after bodily death, it's perfected, it's unmediated, it's immediate, which brings me to that next bullet point. The immediate, unmediated knowledge of God, the intuitive face-to-face vision of the divine essence, again, not seeing with eyeballs, rather comprehension of the intellect. So immediate, obviously the opposite of mediate. Before, Aristotle, all that he could know of God, the God that he could contemplate was that first cause, right? All those boring metaphysical attributes that I articulated in last class. You can only know, Aristotle can only know God by analogy, by his created effects, right? You can know something about an invisible cause from the visible effects. If you remember that from last class, that's the God that Aristotle could contemplate. This contemplation is immediate, right? It's not mediated by anything. Thomas Aquinas calls phantasms or images or even concepts, that we encounter in this life, obstructions to an immediate vision of God. So,
Gazing upon God, unmediated by any obstruction, seeing perfectly with our souls, not imperfectly with our eyes, or even faith for that matter, right? So, to see God who's all perfect, from whom all good things come, entails that these deepest longings that we have, this deep, infinite yearning that is an innate feature of our human nature, this is where it comes to rest. This is where it's satiated. It rests in the object for which it was designed, our telos, our ultimate end, right? This is the goal of life, to get to this. This is relationship with God, because to know God, to know His essence, necessarily entails to love God too, as we'll see actually in a couple of slides here, real briefly. It's a relationship with God. I mean, how bizarre would it be to present to Aristotle the prospect of being in a relationship with God, to actually know God and to love God? Like, that is a profound reality, and because of that, I mean, the beatific vision, this is an endlessly fascinating subject that many theologians have written tomes and volumes on. So this is just kind of an introduction to this, and unfortunately I don't have the time to go in a lot more depth, but it's written about abundantly. This is an excerpt from the Catechism, basically reiterating everything I just covered. Because of His transcendence, God cannot be seen as He is unless He Himself opens up His mystery to man's immediate contemplation and gives him the capacity for it. The Church calls this contemplation of God in the heavenly glory the beatific vision. And then here's Pope Benedict XII and Benedictus Deus, 14th century. I won't read that, but again, reiterates everything I just said, some of these key attributes pertaining to the beatific vision. What about Scripture? There's dozens of Scripture quotes that alludes to this reality. Maybe, a philosophical presentation of the beatific vision that I just provided opens up some riches of this passage, right? Now we see but a dim reflection as in a mirror. So we know God through His creative effects, right? Or through the lens, through the lens of faith, right? It's imperfect. Then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. Or in the Psalms, right? In thy light do we see light. This is even prefigured in the Old Testament, right? So, two primary effects of the beatific vision. The light, of course, the vision is a cause of the light, cause and effect. But also, another fascinating part is rectitude of the will. That's a fancy way of saying one who views the divine essence or enjoys the beatific vision cannot help but love this object. One who views the divine essence is attached with necessity. And that's not only an effect of the beatific vision, but here's the interesting part, it's a prerequisite, right? The rectitude of the will consists in a perfect, pure love of God. You can't reach the beatific vision without that perfect love, because God Himself is a trinity of love. So, how many of you think that when probably most of us here, right, when we die, if we're practicing Catholic and we're living in the state of grace, is our love, can we honestly say it's perfect and it's pure and it's detached from all the goods of the world, that there's no imperfection, that we don't have any lingering attachments that are disordered? Obviously not, right? That you'd be a saint, you'd be a canonized saint immediately, pretty much, right? If that was the reality. So this is where you just, through the logic and applying reason to divine revelation, you just argue for the reality of purgatory, right? A transient state whereby we are cleansed and purified, right? So that we're equipped, we're fit, we're disposed to enter into the beatific vision, right? Isn't that kind of beautiful? That gives, a depth to our doctrine, our teaching in purgatory, right? Only those that perfectly love God can participate in the perfect love of God, which is Trinitarian life. But again, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. I'm going to unpack all of that thoroughly in the next two classes. So, and Scripture attests to this in many places too. In the Beatitudes, right? Blessed are the pure of heart, for they shall see God. Or also, be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. That's another one. I'll skip this in virtue of time because it's fascinating to know how the resurrection, factors into this. Can happiness be lost? Those that are enjoying the beatific vision, can it be lost? No. Again, going back to the self-sufficiency criteria, the exclusion of every deficiency follows, including the fear of ever losing that good. And then Aquinas refutes 3 possible dangers that I won't do for you right now. But if you're interested, I'll send you the slides. Last thing here, I promise, right? So, we already said this is a supernatural end. It transcends our capacities that belong to us in human nature because of that infinite gap, and as we'll see later on, because of the reality of sin that alienates us from God and ruptures that relationship that we are called to. Basically, we need a bridge, right? And that's where I'm going to next class. You're not going to want to miss these next two because this is all theology. The next class, I'm going to situate the beatific vision. I just gave a systematic, technical, rational kind of basis for our ultimate end from a theological and philosophical view. Now I'm going to situate that in the whole story of salvation, the drama of salvation, how that fits in, and of course, the centrality of Christ, and being our means, the way, the truth, and life by which we can attain our ultimate end. We need Christ. Nobody comes to the Father except through Him. And I love this next unit on salvation history. We covered a lot, including some stuff that I can assure you, maybe unless you're trained in theology, have never been exposed to. It's exciting. And then the last class, the fourth class, we're going to tie the bow on the knot of the problem of evil, suffering, and death. That's always endlessly fascinating for Catholics, the theology of suffering and death. Christ not only conquers them, but transforms them. They become our gateway, our way, the way to cross to our ultimate end. It's beautiful. And so the whole last class is going to be about suffering, and you're not going to want to. Please come to that one. And in that last class, I'll print out a nice handout that summarizes all these takeaways from each one of the classes and provide that to you. And as I always mention, you can reach out to me, email me, and I'll send you these slides if you want as well. But just to recap the day, the height of philosophy, the answer to the question of happiness is a life of virtue in the natural contemplation of God. That conception of happiness runs into those roadblocks of suffering and death, and that infinite gap between the creature and the creator. And man reaches out to the infinite in virtue of who we are, our rational faculties. We reach out to the infinite. Anything created cannot satiate those faculties that we have, our intellect and our will. So the theological illumination is that our perfect happiness does consist in a knowledge of God's innocence, the beatific vision of God, that unmediated, face-to-face entrance into the divine life. So we are called to be united to God, to have a relationship with God. And the essence of that involves this apprehension, this comprehension of God intellectually, and then our will, of course, fixes on it in a supernatural divine love. So we'll unpack all that next time. That's only possible through grace. It's only possible through Christ. That's the treasure that we have to offer as Catholics, right? Embarking upon the mission of evangelization. That's the treasure that we have to share with people. And we just arrived at that. We're now thoroughly in the domain of theology. This is a summary of everything. I'm not going to go over that. If you're interested in really unpacking some of that, the problems and the solutions, there they are. I'm going to offer this same class on Friday. If you have friends or family members that missed this one, I'll be offering this exact same class just for this class only on Friday at 9 a.m. in the presentation room. If you want the slides, email me. And once again, our parish, we have high aspirations for our vision for, again, evangelization, right? We want to build our parish, build our community, build our programs, adult programs, youth programs, share content like this, share the love of Christ, share that treasure that I just kind of unpacked there, because people are starving for this. Again, that existential neurosis that I diagnosed and talked about in that first class, right? People are starving for this. So we need the support, we need the infrastructure, we need all that to enable that vision to come to fruition. So it's not just me, it's not just the staff, it's not just Father, but it's you too. You can play a part. It's a team effort. Evangelization is a team effort. One body, many parts. Christ is the head. With that said, you probably ask prayerfully consider donating. I probably should add something grabbed in the baskets back there. But yeah, it'll be spent very wisely. I mean, trust me, and it will be deeply appreciated. We're really grateful for all of your support and for coming to this. This is a big deal. So that's all I got for tonight. So thank you.